Welcome back, guys, to Dark Night Scare. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true disturbing stories about cemeteries in the Appalachian Mountains. It's not just the dead you should worry about. Some things out there never died. But before we begin, please consider subscribing. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and family. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from. Thank you all for your support. It means a lot to me. Now let's start. I set off shortly after sunrise, navigating the winding backroads of eastern Kentucky. My destination was an old property that my cousin Levi had inherited a few months prior, situated near the Virginia border. He mentioned that the place hadn't seen any attention in over a decade. It was overgrown and deteriorating. He wasn't even certain it still had power, but he had arranged for a contractor to meet me there to assess the roof. I was in no hurry. There was no timeline or pressure, just me, the road, and hours of trees encroaching from either side like a tunnel with no exit. It was the sort of drive where one loses track of mileage. The landscape blurs, and you pass abandoned gas stations with shattered windows, rusting swing sets half buried in yards, and hand-painted signs with faded letters. I recall spotting one sign reading "Free HGS" in red paint nailed to a fence post, and I found myself smiling, as if a kid was trying to summon strangers for a hug on a highway that saw little traffic. About 4 hours in, I noticed a gap in the trees, a pair of wooden posts leaning toward each other, appearing too weary to stand straight. With a chain strung between them, rusted links half submerged in weeds. Behind it, a narrow gravel path curved into the woods, disappearing behind a ridge. I pulled over without a second thought. I hadn't intended to stop, but there was something compelling about the path, untouched, as if it had been waiting. After driving for long enough, my legs felt stiff and my back sore. Getting out felt right. I emerged from the car, stretched a bit, and ducked beneath the chain. The gravel was faded and thin, with grass growing through in patches. It crunched beneath my boots for a few steps before surrendering to silence as the path became packed dirt. The woods thickened fast. No underbrush, just endless tree trunks stretching into a mottled grey sky. And it was quiet. I mean eerily quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even a breeze to rustle the leaves overhead. Just this heavy, pressing stillness, as if sound was siphoned out of the air. That's what made me halt for a moment. Growing up in the country, I knew what normal woods sounded like. This was different. The trail opened into a clearing, maybe 100 feet wide. Pine trees formed a circle around it, tall, slightly leaning, with long, scraggly branches that remained still even in a breeze. In the center of the clearing lay a small, unattended cemetery, perhaps 30 headstones, no fence, no markers, no signage, just a jumbled scatter of stones, some upright, others leaning at awkward angles, some partially sunken into the earth. Few bore fresh flowers, only a few old plastic ones remained, brittle and bleached. One bouquet stood out, featuring red plastic roses that appeared melted on one side, as though someone had briefly held a lighter close before abruptly stopping. It was oddly precise, as if done intentionally but abandoned mid-act. Most of the headstones had been worn to the point where nothing could be deciphered anymore. Only vague shapes remained, slumped and half-eaten by moss. A few had initials or dates if examined closely, but nothing that would stand out without crouching down to scrutinize. No church nearby, no driveway, no explanation for its existence. I lingered at the edge for a moment, absorbing it all. Such old family plots aren't uncommon. I'd seen plenty in old territories where generations lay buried beneath their trees, left behind when families moved on. It wasn't unsettling, just quiet. I stepped further in, walking toward one of the few stones that still stood relatively intact. The name had faded, but I discerned a date near the bottom, May 1882. No month or day, just the year carved deeper than the others. That was when I noticed a man standing at the far edge of the clearing, half in shadow, just beyond the last row of stones under the trees. He wore a long black coat and a brown hat, appearing dusty, and there was nothing else. No movement, just him standing there, arms at his sides. I assumed he might be a caretaker or a distant relative visiting a grave. He wasn't close enough to concern me, so I merely nodded in his direction and returned my attention to the stone. But then I noticed movement. When I looked back, he stood much closer, perhaps 10 feet away, dead still. That froze me in my tracks. The ground, while soft in places, wasn't silent. There were dry twigs, bits of loose gravel. No way he could have covered that distance without making a sound. and I hadn't taken my eyes off that area for more than a few seconds. I stood up straight and said, "Afternoon." He did not respond. No blink, no acknowledgement. Just slowly raised his right hand and pointed at the ground beside me. What he pointed to wasn't a grave, no headstone or marker, only a sagging depression in the earth, perhaps 4 feet long with uneven grass and exposed dirt. The grass looked thin, as if it had barely grown back. I looked at it and then back at him. "Didn't realize someone was buried here," I said, stepping back slightly. Still, no response. Just the pointing. I turned and started to walk away, not quickly. I didn't want to appear frightened, but I felt the need to leave. My gaze remained forward while my ears strained to catch any sounds. There were none. When I reached the chain at the entrance, I reached for my keys. Nothing. Checked my other pocket. No keys. Both back pockets. My jacket. I even glanced through the car window to see if they had been left in the ignition. I hadn't lost them. I'm meticulous about checking for them. It's a habit. I ensure I always have them. I patted myself down once more. Still nothing. So, I turned around and retraced my steps, scanning the ground as though I was searching for a dropped piece of jewelry, slowly and carefully bent at the waist. I examined the stones near those odd flowers, and even knelt by the spot where the man had stood. But he was gone. Then, toward the back of the cemetery, I spotted a small glint of metal on the ground. It was a keychain clip, broken, the kind I use. The snap hook was bent wide open, as if it had been pried with something. I stared at it. There was nothing old about it. The break looked recent. I continued until I reached the area where he had pointed before. The ground had changed. Instead of a depression, there was now a slight rise, as if something had been buried, then unburied, and poorly reburied again. The dirt was loose and darker in sections, and the grass had been flattened. There were faint scratches in the dirt. Someone had traced a word with something blunt. One word, "stay." A jolt ran through my chest, like plunging into cold water. I looked around again, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then I heard it, a faint clink, metal against stone, sharp and deliberate. I turned about 10 feet away, half hidden behind a tilted headstone. And there were my keys again, just sitting there. The same keys I'd checked for twice. The clip was intact, no sign that it had ever been broken. I didn't move right away, just stood there staring. There was no one else in sight, and the woods remained silent, neither birds nor breeze. I approached them carefully, picked them up by the ring with 2 fingers. They felt cool, solid, familiar. I didn't run, but I didn't linger either. As I reached the chain again, I did not step over it. I lifted it gently and slipped through as if I were backing out of a room without saying goodbye. Back at the car, I opened the door, settled inside, turned the key, and the engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't retrace my earlier route. Not a thought crossed my mind in that direction. I turned the wheel and took the first road I encountered heading anywhere else. Eventually, I stumbled upon a gas station. I didn't stop there, moving until I encountered other vehicles, billboards, anything resembling humanity. I never mentioned a word to Levi. Three days into a solo hike on a lesser-known section of the Appalachian Trail near Calhoun Ridge, North Carolina, I spotted a trail that wasn't marked on my map. It branched off from the main trail just beyond a granite outcrop, with a view over a narrow valley. A strip of sun-bleached red cloth was tied to a bent branch right at the fork. Faded, frayed, barely hanging on. That's what caught my attention. The trail itself was narrow, resembling a deer track more than a proper footpath, overgrown and slanting steeply to the right. I figured it might have been an old maintenance path, or perhaps a trail made by hunters. I decided to follow it for a bit just to see where it led. If it was a mistake, I could always backtrack. Yet almost immediately, the atmosphere felt different. Not creepy, but definitely off. Too still, unnaturally quiet. No wind, no bird song, just the sound of my boots crunching on the ground. And even that seemed to fade over time, as if the earth was absorbing the noise. The dirt beneath my feet became spongier the deeper I ventured in. After around 15 minutes, I reached a clearing, and that's where I discovered it. A wrought iron fence, only about waist high, encircling a compact group of headstones. Dozens of them were clustered closely together in a strangely tidy space. There was no visible path leading into or out of this area. The stones weren't arranged in neat rows. They were scattered about, as if tossed there haphazardly. Some were leaning, others were nearly swallowed by the earth. Moss had overtaken most of them, but it was the names, or rather the absence of full names, that froze me in place. They were merely single words chiseled into the stone. Smith, Pitt, Loner, twins, son. That last one was barely a marker, just a crooked stone, about the size of a shoebox, awkwardly shoved into the ground as if someone hadn't intended for it to stay there. My unease grew when I noticed something even more troubling. The grass inside the fence had been cut neatly and recently. It wasn't just short, it was pristine, as if someone had carefully groomed it with scissors. No evidence of trampled brush, no footprints, no indication of any tools being used. The surrounding woods were wild and overgrown, yet this little patch resembled a hand-tended garden, and there was no visible trail leading to it. I didn't venture inside. I merely lingered at the edge, snapped a few photos with my phone, and kept a wary eye on the tree line. A strange sensation washed over me. I felt as if I wasn't alone, not in a paranoid way, but like I'd stumbled unwittingly into someone else's domain. I took a few steps back toward the main trail, and then I heard it, a faint scraping sound behind me. Not a snap, not a thump, but stone dragging across stone, as if someone was hauling something heavy across a floor. I turned to look. One of the headstones had toppled over, the leaner one, I think, just flat against the ground. I could not recall hearing it fall, just the soft sound of its drag. Maybe it had always been like that. Honestly, I couldn't remember. I hurriedly exited the area. That night, I set up my tent near a dry creek bed, mostly because it felt neutral. I skipped the fire and ate cold food straight from my pack. I was too tired to think clearly, yet not exhausted enough to silence my thoughts entirely. I kept replaying images of the clearing in my head, the names, the cut grass, and that unsettling sound. At some point past midnight, closer to 3 a.m. if I had to guess, I woke up soaked with sweat. Not just damp, but dripping. The tent was zipped, no breeze to speak of, and the air inside felt thick and humid, reminiscent of a greenhouse. My skin stuck to the sleeping bag. I sat up, unzipped the front flap, and leaned out to catch a breath. That's when I saw them. A pair of bare feet stood across the fire pit. Pale and still, they faced me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't blink. There stood a boy, perhaps 10 years old, thin, shirtless. His skin had that odd, washed-out tone like driftwood bleached by the sun. His face was obscured in shadow, and not a word escaped his mouth. He didn't shift an inch, standing there as if he'd been placed down. I blinked once, and he vanished. Gone. No footsteps, no rustle, just emptiness. I stayed awake until dawn, convinced it was a hallucination. Altitude, heat, or maybe a dream I hadn't quite shaken off. I sought a rational explanation to write it off. However, in the morning, I discovered my backpack had been opened. Nothing was missing, nothing moved, just open. Every zipper unzipped, every flap hanging loose. I didn't take a break that day. Instead, I pushed hard and returned to the trailhead a day earlier than planned. I hitchhiked to Hickory and didn't utter a word about anything to anyone. Not to my roommate, and not even to myself, really. I buried the memory deep and moved on. 2 weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I decided to print the photos from the hike. The usual shots came out clear: mountains, trees, a blurry selfie near a waterfall. However, every photo of the cemetery appeared blurred, washed out, overexposed into pure white. Every photo save for one. In that particular image, someone knelt next to the twins' headstone. A man in a long vintage black coat. His head was turned. Not just turned, but angled directly toward the camera, staring straight into the lens. His expression was vacant, neither angry nor sad, just neutral. Only his eyes were distinctly clear in the entire shot, as if the camera had focused solely on them, disregarding everything else. I hadn't seen him when I took the picture. I know that for a fact. So I went back. A year later, I retraced my steps on that hike. The same stretch, the same ridge. I even located the granite outcrop again, standing in the exact place I stood before. Yet, there was no path this time, no red cloth, no gap in the trees, just dense brush and an unbroken forest. I even checked the saved GPS coordinates, pinpointing the spot where the cemetery should have been. Still nothing. Yet, as I stood there, the ground beneath my boots felt soft, almost familiar. Upon returning home, I rummaged through my phone for the second trip pictures. Every single photo from that weekend was missing. No error, no corruption, just gone. My cloud backup failed too, the first time that had ever happened. That night, I heard something in the hallway. It wasn't footsteps. It was slower, a dragging sound, as if something substantial were sliding along the old floorboards. It halted just outside my bedroom door. I turned on the light. There was nothing there. The following morning, I walked into the kitchen to find every single cabinet open. The fridge door too. My phone lay face down on the floor as if someone had dropped it from a height. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anybody. Instead, I invited a friend to stay with me, not explaining why, just saying I hadn't been sleeping well. That summer, I stumbled upon a peculiar job mowing cemeteries along the winding back roads of the Appalachians. A friend mentioned it casually, and within 2 days, I had a key to a supply shed, a gas card, and a clipboard filled with cemetery names and hand-drawn maps. The town paid in cash under the table, just enough to keep gas in my truck and food in my fridge. While not lucrative, it was considerably better than sitting idle. One particular site left a lasting impression on me. I didn't know its official name. On my map, it was simply labeled Lot 7 Riddage. It was the most remote, nestled deep in the hills beyond a place called Marlow Creek. Reaching it required driving down a narrow dirt road that twisted through trees, as though it had been carved out with a pocket knife. Eventually, the path ended at a rusted cattle gate that bore no signage, no fencing, just 2 posts with a chain I had to lift myself. I parked there, dragged the mower down a narrow footpath nearly engulfed by woods, and emerged into a clearing. The cemetery stretched out like an irregularly shaped patch of sloped ground, about the size of a football field, overgrown at the edges with brush. The headstones were sparse and scattered. Some stood upright, others cracked, a few barely visible above the earth. No 2 rows aligned, resembling the remnants of a forgotten village more than a burial ground. I mowed it as I did the others, row by row, then loaded up and left without giving it too much thought, until that little grey stone appeared. It was during my 2nd or 3rd week mowing Ridge Row that I spotted it. Approximately knee-high, flat on top, unpolished. No name, no epitaph. Just a single thing etched into the stone in worn, blocky numbers, 1972. I stood there, staring at it for a moment, trying to recall if I'd seen it the week before. I hadn't, or at least I was fairly certain I hadn't, but I reassured myself I must have simply missed it. It was easy to do in a place like this, where half the stones were sunk deep into the ground or covered with moss. I mowed around it as though it were nothing. The following week, it had moved once again. Initially, I thought perhaps I had just forgotten. The stone was now positioned between 2 tall, leaning markers. I distinctly remembered trimming around it. I knelt by it, inspecting the engraving. Same rough slab, still displaying that same lone date, 1972. I had no doubt it had shifted. This realization gave me pause, but I brushed it off as a mix-up in memory. The place hardly exuded organization. I finished mowing and left, yet the image of that stone lingered in my mind. When I got home, I even sketched out where I thought the markers had been, trying to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. The next time I returned, the stone had shifted again, not far, but enough for it to stand out. This time, it was near the old oak tree at the hillside's edge, half shrouded in shade. I stood over it for quite a while. Nothing seemed to add up. These stones weren't exactly portable, and no one else ever ventured out there. The path was too narrow for trucks, and I would have noticed any signs of digging or dragging. On a whim, I brought a small wooden stake with me the next week. After finishing my mowing, I drove that stake deeply into the ground alongside the stone, aligning it perfectly to avoid any potential misinterpretation of its position. I even snapped a photograph on my phone for my own sanity. The following week, the stake remained, but the stone was missing. I found it 10 rows down the hill, neatly placed between 2 broken markers as if it had always belonged there. Same size, same shape, same year. I verified my photo. It was indeed the same stone that had penetrated my thoughts. I eventually mentioned the phenomenon to Harris, who operated the hardware store back in town. He was the one who sold me fuel stabilizers and replacement mower blades. If anyone could provide insight, it would be him. I brought it up casually, inquiring if he knew anything about the cemetery near Marlow Creek. He fell silent. "That one's been there longer than anyone alive can recall," he finally replied. "It used to be bigger before the road came through. They moved some graves when they laid the new highway. Not all of them made it where they were supposed to go." I inquired what he meant, and he simply looked at me, suggesting, "You don't like what you're witnessing out there? Best to quit before it notices you back." He then rang up my items and didn't say another word. I should have heeded his warning, but I didn't. I needed the cash. The next time I returned, it was early evening. The sun hung low, and the entire place felt more enclosed than usual. I was rushing to finish, eager to complete my work before the darkness descended. I was working through a patch near the center of the lot when the mower clanked violently and jerked to a stop. It didn't sound like a rock. It felt as if the blade had struck something dense and flat. I killed the engine and crouched down. The grass appeared normal. However, when I pressed my hand into the soil, it yielded too easily, as if it had been excavated recently. I began to clear away the dirt, uncertain what I was expecting to find. About a foot down, I struck wood, pale, dry planks that didn't match anything else I'd seen buried there. This wasn't a coffin. It resembled more of a crate, squared edges, rough nails. Hesitating momentarily, I pried the lid back using my mower blade's edge. Inside was an empty, hollow space. No remains, no keepsakes, just a void beneath the dirt. I stared at it for a long while, then restored the soil, pressed it flat, and resumed mowing as if nothing had occurred. When I returned the following week, that nameless stone stood right over the same location. That was when I ceased pretending it was all happening in my imagination. On the last occasion I went, I felt no desire to be there. I forced myself to finish. Every noise sounded sharper. Every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. The mower seemed louder than usual, drowning out something I wasn't meant to hear. Once I completed the final row, I turned to survey the slope behind me. I froze. New mounds littered the hillside. Not patches of taller grass, but actual mounds of fresh dirt. Perhaps 6 or 7, each spaced evenly along the lines I had just mowed. Perfect little humps like graves awaiting markers. They hadn't been there previously. I stood at the cattle gate, gripping the chain tightly, simply staring at those mounds, trying to muster the courage to check. But I couldn't move. There was something unsettling about it I couldn't articulate. An instinct that if I ventured back up that path, something would be waiting for me. So, I didn't. I left the gate hanging wide open and drove away without glancing in the rearview mirror. I didn't bother washing the mower either. It remains in my shed, with blades caked in the dried grass from that night. The town clerk called me twice after that, leaving messages about completing my route, but I never returned. The director, a man named Leonard who always appeared to be one day away from retirement, was candid about the situation. "We have no idea how many cemeteries exist out there," he said, sifting through a pile of records as if playing cards. Family plots, abandoned churchyards, old ridge burials, they're everywhere. In the past, people used to bury their loved ones right on their land, not bothering with permits or formal headstones. We have hundreds of these sites noted, and likely twice that number that were never documented at all. My job sounded straightforward enough. Hike out to the known sites, verify their locations, take photos, and jot down readable names and dates. If I stumbled upon an undocumented site, my task was to document it as best as possible. Most of them were hidden behind collapsing barns or had been consumed by dense forest, places you simply wouldn't discover unless you were genuinely looking. Initially, I loved the work. It was quiet, peaceful even. My mornings consisted of loading my pack with water, a camera, clipboard, bug spray, and then spending hours wandering through brush and old deer trails. Sometimes I'd stumble upon a plot within minutes, just off a logging road. Other times I'd wander for hours, following faded directions like left at the split oak or past the burnt silo, hoping I was in the right hollow. The cemeteries were almost always small, 10 to 15 graves at most, typically marked with worn sandstone stones featuring initials or simple names, perhaps a cross or a birth year. A few were just uncarved stones standing upright in a row. Some had been swallowed by such thick undergrowth that I had to use my boots to feel for them. It was humbling. These people had lived entire lives out there. They worked, married, raised children, and ultimately died. Now, they were just names fading into stone, tucked behind blackberry thickets and forgotten barns. I often knelt in the dirt, brushed away moss, copied what I could read, and moved on. Eventually, I stumbled upon a site, a cemetery listed on a yellowed index card buried deep in one of the cabinets, almost as if someone had filed it away, hoping it wouldn't be examined closely. The card indicated that the cemetery was 2 hours from the nearest maintained road, near the peak of a ridge called Parsons Hill. There was no photo, no coordinates, merely a hand-drawn square on a map with a list of names, 27 in total, all from the same family, all buried in a single clearing between 1870 and 1922. No one has been up there in decades, Leonard informed me. The last survey was conducted in the mid-60s, and the individual who did it left minimal documentation, merely noting, site present, difficult to access. That should have served as my first warning. I set out early, armed with vague directions about following a dry creek bed until the terrain leveled out, then ascending north along the ridgeline. The heat was relentless, and the bugs were bothersome, with the brush thickening rapidly. I encountered a sort of tangled, clingy undergrowth that persisted in slapping me in the face as I pushed through. Eventually, I lost the trail entirely and had to scramble up a slope, utilizing roots for handholds. By the time I reached the ridge crest, my legs felt like lead and my shirt soaked through. I expected to discover a neatly maintained plot similar to the others, overgrown perhaps, but still recognizable. Instead, I stepped into a clearing filled with slanted, uneven headstones that appeared to have been scattered from a great height. Some were nearly sunken to their bases, while others had twisted sideways as though the earth had attempted to expel them. There was no fence surrounding the area, no path, and no sign of past visitors. Just a dozen or so stones, each in disarray. I took a deep breath, wiped my sweat-drenched brow, and began the routine. Find a stone, read the inscription if possible, write the information down, take a photo. The first few were manageable, just some lichen and minor chipping, still legible. However, about 20 minutes in, I stumbled across a headstone that made me stop dead in my tracks. The last name was familiar. I checked my notes. I had already documented that name. Same surname, same year of death, same middle initial. It was either a duplicate entry, or someone with the identical name had passed away the same year and was buried a mere 20 feet apart. I tried to dismiss the urgency tugging at my thoughts. Perhaps it was a family tradition, sons named after fathers, uncles, cousins, not an uncommon practice around here. Nevertheless, something felt off. I retraced my steps to the earlier stone for a double check, only to realize it wasn't the same. It wasn't just a memory lapse, the carving had changed. The letters looked sharper, as if they had been freshly etched. However, the name didn't match what I had written. A strange disconnect washed over me, as if something was out of sync. That's when I noticed another peculiarity. Each time I briefly turned my head away from a headstone, perhaps to write or take a photograph, returning to it would reveal subtle changes. Letters morphing, dates altering. One marker near the edge had clearly read Rachel upon first viewing. Deep grooves, clean carving. Only to return later on and find the name completely erased. Not faded, but vanished as though it had never been etched into the stone. I felt a tightening sensation crawling over my scalp. Pulling out my camera became a necessity. I needed proof. If something was awry with my memory, so be it. A camera would reveal the truth, except it didn't. Every photograph came out entirely black. I attempted everything. Swapping batteries, rebooting, checking the lens, changing the memory card. Nothing succeeded. Not blurry, not overexposed, simply solid black, as if the clearing itself refused to be documented. In that moment of realization, I understood I was standing within a layout that had shifted. The graves were no longer in positions I'd left them. The rows had drawn inward, forming a loose, irregular circle. This didn't happen before my eyes, but somehow, in the fleeting moments where my attention drifted, they had moved. Panic trickled into my mind as I turned slowly, desperate to find my entry point. Yet the trees were wrong now too, more tightly packed, shrouded in darkness. The path I'd come from had vanished, yielding only further graves. My chest tightened. I wasn't fully panicking, but an instinct at my core urged me to move, to escape. That's when I noticed it. At the circle's center stood a headstone taller than the rest, smooth, pale, untouched by moss or cracks. I hadn't seen it upon my arrival, nor do I think it was there initially. Now it loomed before me, as if it had always awaited my presence. I didn't consciously decide to approach it. My legs simply pressed onward. There was no name inscribed upon it, only 2 words carved clean and deep. Not yet. In that moment, my body caught up with the scream my mind had been emitting. I stumbled backward, my boot clipping a low marker behind me, causing me to fall hard, scraping my palm against rock. The impact knocked the breath out of me, but when I looked up, the circle had dissolved. The headstones were scattered once more, crooked and erratic. The trees had shifted too. The break in the forest was back, clear and bright. The path I had entered upon stood open. I didn't even contemplate gathering my notes or touching the camera. I ran. I didn't stop until I hit gravel and spotted Leonard's old station wagon down the hill. I am Sarah McKinney, and until 6 months ago, I thought the most challenging part of any job would involve difficult customers or unreasonable supervisors. At 24 years old, freshly graduated with a degree in landscape architecture, I was fervently seeking work that would help me pay off my student loans while I searched for something more aligned with my field. When a job posting for a cemetery grounds maintenance specialist at Devil's Den Municipal Cemetery in eastern Kentucky crossed my path, I applied without hesitation. The pay was decent, the hours flexible, and honestly, I imagined that working in a cemetery would provide a peaceful and quiet environment compared to most other jobs. Devil's Den Cemetery encompasses around 40 acres of gentle hills just outside Hazard, Kentucky. Established in 1887, it serves as the final resting place for several thousand residents, from early coal mining families to more recent additions. The cemetery divides into sections depending on the time period in which individuals were interred. The oldest section, dating from the 1880s through the 1920s, occupies the highest hill and boasts numerous elaborate Victorian-era monuments and mausoleums. The newer sections cascade down the hillsides and across the valley floor, featuring simplistic headstones and a more modern visual landscape. During my interview for the position, I met Robert Hutchkins, the cemetery supervisor who had been employed there for 37 years. In his early 60s, Robert was a quiet man with graying hair and weathered hands, shaped by decades spent working outdoors. He explained that the job primarily involved basic groundskeeping tasks, mowing grass, trimming around headstones, planting seasonal flowers, and maintaining the network of gravel roads and walking paths throughout the cemetery. "It's not glamorous work," he said, "but it is important. People come here to remember their loved ones, and they deserve to find this place well-maintained and respectful." I was moved by his evident dedication to the role and his sincere care for families visiting the cemetery. He offered me the job on the spot, with the understanding that I would begin the following Monday. I would primarily work during daylight hours, although occasional evening or weekend shifts might be necessary during busy times, like Memorial Day or significant holidays. However, Robert didn't share with me during the interview the cemetery's reputation among locals for being haunted. Not your typical ghost stories surrounding most old cemeteries, but rather specific documented incidents reported by numerous witnesses over the years. He also neglected to mention that the prior grounds worker had quit without notice after only 6 weeks on the job, leaving behind just a brief note stating that the position was not what he had anticipated. In my first few days at Devil's Den, things unfolded precisely as I had hoped. The work was physically demanding but satisfying, with the solitude and serene atmosphere of the cemetery bringing me immense peace. I would arrive each morning at 7, check in with Robert to discuss daily priorities, and then spend the next 8 hours working through various sections of the grounds. The pay schedule permitted me to work Monday through Friday, with occasional Saturday hours when needed. The cemetery's layout made it relatively easy to organize my daily workflow. I typically began in the newer sections, which required the most basic maintenance tasks like mowing and edging, before gradually moving up the hill to the older sections, where hand trimming around delicate headstones and clearing weeds from decorative ironwork was needed. By late afternoon, I would usually conclude in the oldest section at the top of the hill, where many intricate monuments required careful cleaning and upkeep. It was during my second week on the job that I first noticed unusual occurrences in the oldest section of the cemetery. Several grand mausoleums and monuments showed signs of recent disturbances, despite most of the individuals buried in that area dying decades beforehand. Fresh flowers frequently appeared at certain graves, although I never witnessed anyone placing them there. More puzzling, some mausoleum doors bore scratches around the locks, suggesting that someone had tried to force them open. When I brought these observations to Robert's attention, his reaction was immediate and concerning. He paused his work, directing a serious look at me. "Sarah, there's something I probably should have mentioned when you started here. This cemetery has some unusual characteristics that you need to be aware of, especially if you're going to be working in the older sections alone." He guided me to a small office building near the cemetery entrance and poured us both some coffee from an old percolator, which looked as though it had been there since the 1970s. Sitting across from me, he began what turned into the most unsettling conversation of my life. "Devil's Den Cemetery is built on land with a complicated history," he started. "Before the cemetery was established, this area was the site of some very dark events during the late 1800s. There were reports of strange rituals taking place in the woods that once covered these hills. Complaints came from residents of surrounding communities regarding screams and chanting heard at night, along with several children from local families disappearing without a trace. Robert paused to take a sip of coffee, and I could see that discussing this topic weighed heavily on him. When the local authorities eventually investigated, they uncovered evidence that could only be described as occult activities: makeshift altars, animal remains, and perplexing symbols carved into trees. Numerous people were arrested, but the ringleader, a man named Cornelius Blackwood, was never found. He simply vanished into the mountains and was never seen again. Robert continued, explaining that the cemetery had been deliberately established on this land to consecrate it and prevent any future occult activities. The local church leaders believed that burying people on the site would purify it and repel any malevolent influences. For the most part, their strategy had been successful, and Devil's Den Cemetery had served the community without major incidents for over a century. However, irregularities have always persisted, especially in the oldest section, where some original participants in those rituals were eventually buried after they passed away from natural causes years later. We received reports from groundskeepers and visitors about strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, and equipment malfunctions that seem to occur with greater frequency in that area, Robert explained. I inquired why he hadn't shared this information sooner. His response was both understandable and frustrating. Most individuals who work here rarely experience anything unusual, and I didn't want to sway your perspective or make you anxious about a job that you might enjoy and excel at. But you've shown enough observant aptitude to notice things that others miss, so I believe you deserve to know what you might be facing. Robert proceeded to outline a set of guidelines he described as common-sense precautions for working in the cemetery's oldest section. I was advised never to work alone in that area after sunset, to leave immediately if I heard voices or music emanating from the surrounding woods and report to him, and importantly, if evidence came to light that someone had tampered with grave sites or mausoleums. I should not investigate it alone and should contact him right away. There are individuals still practicing some old beliefs in this area, he explained. Most are harmless, but occasionally we encounter those who believe they can use the cemetery for their purposes. They often seek grave soil or personal items buried with the deceased, objects they think possess spiritual power. For the next several weeks, I carefully followed Robert's guidelines and encountered no unusual happenings. I remained focused on my work, steering clear of the oldest section during late afternoon hours, ensuring that I departed well before sunset each day. I started to think Robert's warnings were overly cautious and that whatever strange history the cemetery held was firmly in the past. Everything shifted on a Thursday evening in late May. I had been working late in preparation for Memorial Day weekend, when hundreds of families would come to decorate graves and remember their loved ones. Robert had asked me to stay until around 7 p.m. to finish planting seasonal flowers in some of the newer areas, which I gladly accepted, as the overtime pay would aid in my student loan payments. While I was working in a section about halfway up the hill, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching on the cemetery's main road. Considering it wasn't unusual for families to visit graves during early evening hours, I paid little mind. However, the vehicle continued past the newer sections, heading straight towards the oldest part of the cemetery at the top of the hill. My curiosity piqued. Who could possibly be visiting that area so late in the day? I moved closer to observe the road leading to the older section. What I saw immediately confirmed Robert's concerns about people tampering with grave sites. A pickup truck had parked near one of the expansive family mausoleums, and 3 individuals were unloading equipment from the back. Even from a distance, it was apparent they had shovels, pry bars, and what looked like metal detectors or other electronic gear. They were clearly not there to pay their respects to deceased relatives. Though I recalled Robert's advice against investigating such matters independently, I also knew he'd gone home for the day, and it might take him a while to return. If I left immediately, these individuals could complete whatever plans they had and vanish into the mountains before he arrived. Instead of taking the advice I knew I should, I felt compelled to get closer and better understand what they were doing. I hid behind larger monuments, moving up the hill while using the rolling landscape and scattered trees to keep out of sight. As I approached, I overheard fragments of their conversation, terrible enough as it was, centering on which graves appeared to contain valuable items. With metal detectors scanning the ground around headstones, they were clearly focused on one mausoleum, the vast granite structure that bore the name Blackwood across its entrance. I recalled Robert mentioning that name when discussing the cemetery's history. The family mausoleum of Cornelius Blackwood, the very lead figure behind the past occult activities that took place on this land over a century ago. The three grave robbers, for that's clearly what they were, had brought a portable cutting tool with them, attempting to break through the metal door of the mausoleum. They continued to chat amongst themselves, and I picked up snippets of their hurried dialogue. Old books and ritual items that could be worth a fortune to collectors. This door is stronger than we thought. It's going to take longer. We need to hurry before someone arrives. Realizing I needed to call for assistance, I checked my cell phone for a signal, but found nothing. While this did not surprise me, cell reception in the mountainous area is hit or miss. It meant I couldn't reach Robert or the police without driving to an area with better coverage. Just as I contemplated my options, an unexpected situation unfolded. The trio of individuals suddenly halted, standing motionless, as if they were listening to something. One of them pointed toward the woods, gesturing in a manner I could not hear clearly. From behind a large headstone approximately 50 yards away, I directed my gaze where they pointed. What met my eyes defied rational explanation. A figure was walking deliberately from the tree line toward the Blackwood Mausoleum, moving with an unnatural gait that made my skin crawl. As the figure approached, the three grave robbers dropped their tools and instinctively began to back away from the mausoleum. I could overhear their panic-infused voices in whispers, but their gestures conveyed they were terrified of whoever or whatever was advancing toward them. Upon reaching the mausoleum, the dark figure turned to face the robbers, and to my astonishment, his voice carried through the cemetery with clarity, despite lacking the shouts one might expect. "You do not belong here. This ground is consecrated, and you have no right to disturb the dead." One of the grave robbers, presumably their leader, attempted to retort, but his words barely came as a whisper. We were just looking. We didn't mean any harm." The dark figure raised one hand, and an immediate chill enveloped the entire cemetery, the temperature plummeting by what felt like 20 degrees. Frost began to crystallize on headstones nearby. I could see my breath materializing in thick white clouds. "Leave this place," the figure commanded. "Depart now and never return. Should I find you here again, the consequences will be far worse than this mere cold." The three grave robbers wasted no time. They abandoned their tools, racing toward their pickup truck while stumbling around headstones in their haste to escape. Within seconds, they had the engine roaring and sped down the cemetery road faster than the rough terrain allowed. But the dark figure was not done yet. Turning toward me, he walked toward my hiding spot behind the headstone. As he neared, I managed to see his features for the first time. What I observed filled me with the understanding of why the robbers had been engulfed with fear. His sharp, angular features bore deep-set eyes glowing with their inner light. His skin appeared unusually pale, almost grey, resembling someone long deceased. When he smiled, I caught sight of yellowed and broken teeth, shadowed by dark stains around his mouth akin to dried blood. "You work here," he announced, his voice echoing with a hollow resonance. "You care for this place and show proper respect for the dead." Speech fled me. I could only nod in response. "Good," he replied. "Then you understand that some graves should never be disturbed, and certain secrets must remain buried. The presence here tonight will not return, but others may come. When they do, you must be ready to protect what lies beneath this ground." Reaching into his coat, he retrieved an ancient brass key, ornate and tarnished by age. "This opens every lock in the cemetery," he instructed, placing the key into my trembling hand. "Use it only when necessary, and only to prevent defilement of the dead. Do you understand?" I nodded once more, though I was uncertain about what I was truly agreeing to. "Remember," he cautioned, beginning to fade like fog in the morning light. "Some things are buried for a reason. Guard them well." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the cemetery, with only the sound of wind rustling through the trees and the gradually warming air as the supernatural chill lifted. I quit my position at Devil's Den Cemetery the following morning. Robert understood when I explained that the role was not what I had anticipated, but I refrained from sharing the details of my encounter with the mysterious dark figure. I left the brass key on his desk with a note stating that I found it while tidying the older section and believed it might hold some significance. 6 months later, I now work as a landscape designer for a firm in Lexington, and I have never experienced greater job satisfaction. Yet sometimes, late at night, I find myself pondering that cemetery, and whether Robert found another willing to work where the dead do not always rest at peace. Nightmares about that dark figure and his warning about safeguarding what lies beneath the ground still haunt me, and I often question what could have transpired had I not been there that night to witness his intervention with the intruders. Some jobs, I've come to recognize, carry responsibilities that extend far beyond what seems to be reflected in the job description. I'm Clayton Matthews, a professor specializing in Appalachian history at East Tennessee State University. For 23 years, I've dedicated my research to exploring the social and cultural timeline of mountain communities, particularly focusing on demographic patterns, migrations, and cemetery records that help us comprehend how these isolated populations developed over time. This work necessitates extensive field trips across the region to document burial sites, church records, and family histories, providing insight into lives left with few other historical markers. In the summer of 2023, I was awarded a research grant to examine abandoned cemeteries in eastern Kentucky, specifically targeting burial grounds that supported small mountain communities during the late 1800s to early 1900s. Many of these cemeteries house invaluable genealogical and demographic information yet to be systematically documented, and my project aimed at creating a digital archive to preserve this data for future researchers and family historians. The grant facilitated funding for a graduate research assistant. I had good fortune in hiring Jennifer Walsh, a doctoral candidate studying Appalachian studies who demonstrated exceptional skill in historical research and cemetery documentation. Together, we intended to utilize the summer months to visit approximately 30 burial grounds, capturing photographs of headstones, recording inscriptions, and cross-referencing our findings with historical data available. Lost Soul Cemetery ranked as one of the sites we had on our research list, situated in a remote area of Leslie County, Kentucky. Based on the scant information accessible about the burial ground, it had been established in the 1870s to serve several small mining communities formed around coal extraction projects in the locality. By the 1920s, these communities had been forgotten. Alongside the cemetery itself, Jennifer and I set out for the Lost Souls Cemetery location on a Tuesday morning in early July. The burial ground could be found roughly 5 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only via a rugged dirt track that meandered through thick forest and crossed over numerous small streams. The seclusion of the site was astounding, even for Appalachian standards, and it was evident that very few visitors had set foot in the cemetery in recent decades. Upon finally spotting the cemetery, we were greeted with a burial ground larger and better preserved than we had anticipated from the scant historical records. The place contained around 150 graves, ranging from the 1870s through the 1940s. Most headstones were simple markers made of limestone or marble, yet several more ornate monuments indicated that some families in the community had found moderate prosperity amid the mining boom. We commenced our documentation work by methodically photographing and recording every headstone within the cemetery, a process that generally spans hours depending on the size of the site and the condition of the markers. I documented detailed details about names, dates, and family connections observable from the inscriptions as Jennifer tackled photographic documentation. During our preliminary documentation phase, I noticed something peculiar regarding the demographic trends exhibited in Lost Soul Cemetery. The birth and death dates inscribed on the headstones revealed significant gaps in the historical record that did not correspond with known migratory patterns or community abandonment in the region. For instance, we discovered many graves dating from the 1870s and 1880s, followed by a notable gap showcasing a scarcity of burials during the 1890s and early 1900s, and finally another cluster from the 1910s and 1920s. This pattern stands in contrast to what we expected based on knowledge of the coal mining communities that had thrived there, which should have exhibited steady population growth followed by decline. Curiously, we found numerous family names on headstones from the 1870s and 1880s entirely absent from the later graves, signaling that entire families may have vanished from the community during the gap. Yet there were no historical records detailing mass migrations, epidemic diseases, or mining disasters that could account for such dramatic population declines in that specific time frame. We spent the entirety of our first day completing our documentation of the available graves, both of us agreeing the observed demographic anomalies warranted further investigation. We chose to return the next day, bringing metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to search for unmarked graves that might elucidate the missing population data. When we arrived at Lost Soul Cemetery on Wednesday morning, we instantly perceived something that neither of us could explain rationally. There were additional headstones present that hadn't been noticed during our visit the day before. Rather than a few markers that might have slipped our attention, an entire section of graves appeared to date back to the 1890s and early 1900s, exactly the period we had previously documented as empty. The new headstones were placed in an area of the cemetery that we diligently examined and photographed the day prior, exhibiting the same degree of weathering and age as those markers we had already recorded. Jennifer and I meticulously compared our photographs and notes from the previous day and deemed it undeniable. Approximately 25 new graves had emerged overnight in Lost Soul Cemetery, complete with weathered headstones appearing to have been in place for over a century. Furthermore, the names and dates inscribed on these new markers precisely filled in the demographic gaps we had identified in our studies. The absent families from the 1890s and early 1900s were now represented in the cemetery, exhibiting death dates that created a logical trajectory of community population growth and decline. We spent the morning photographing and documenting these newly appeared graves, grappling with how such an occurrence was feasible. The headstones exuded an authentic age with natural weathering and lichen growth that would have taken decades to develop. The land surrounding the graves bore no signs of recent disturbance, and the surrounding vegetation was well established. However, as we performed our work, we also observed anomalous changes within the cemetery that hinted we were on the verge of experiencing something far beyond mere confusion regarding our initial observations. Several graves we documented on Tuesday now displayed different inscriptions containing names and dates inconsistent with our photographs and notes. Most disturbingly, some headstones that were intact during our Tuesday visits now appeared shattered or severely weathered, while others that had once been damaged or illegible were now in pristine condition with clearly visible inscriptions. By noon, we were compelled to confront the possibility that we witnessed some sort of temporal anomaly enabling the cemetery to simultaneously exist in multiple periods. The burial ground began unveiling shifting historical configurations, flashing glimpses of various versions of how it appeared at different times throughout its past. We devised a controlled experiment to assess our hypothesis. Jennifer positioned herself at one end of the cemetery while I moved to the opposite end, carefully counting the total number of visible graves from our respective positions. Upon comparing our counts, we discovered she identified 173 graves, while I recorded only 146. We repeated this experiment various times during the afternoon, always achieving differing results. The number of visible graves ebbed and flowed, occasionally rising beyond 200 or dropping below 100. The specifics of which graves were visible or concealed also varied, entire family plots appearing and disappearing seemingly at random. As the day unfolded, the temporal fluctuations intensified and became more frequent. One moment, we documented a particular headstone, only to discover, mere minutes later, it had been replaced by another marker strewn with entirely different information. At times, we recorded the same identity interred in multiple graves, each carrying different death dates, suggesting a view into divergent timelines we were observing. The most alarming moment arose when Jennifer encountered her own name inscribed on a headstone bearing a date of 1897. The engraving read, "Jennifer Walsh, beloved daughter, 1875 to 1897, taken by the mountain fever." I could clearly view the headstone, but upon attempting to photograph it, the image yielded nothing but an empty expanse of ground. That evening, we returned to our hotel, devoting hours to researching Lost Soul Cemetery along with the communities it had served. The documents we unearthed in the local historical archives provided a plausible explanation for the temporal anomalies we had been subjected to, though it raised numerous unsettling inquiries. According to records obtained from the Leslie County Historical Society, Lost Soul Cemetery was the site of a catastrophic event in 1896, a mine collapse entrapping 37 men underground for several days. During rescue efforts, their families congregated at the cemetery, praying for their safe return, only to suffer devastation when the men were ultimately declared deceased. Confusion surrounded the prevailing historical narrative, however, regarding what transpired post-disaster. Some accounts suggested the surviving families fled immediately after the ordeal, abandoning their residences. Other records implied the community continued to exist for several more decades, gradually disappearing as mining resources became depleted. Intriguingly, documentation also indicated residents reported supernatural phenomena in and around Lost Soul Cemetery following the mining disaster. Eyewitnesses claimed to have observed lights dancing about the graves at night, to hear the voices of the dead calling from the earth beneath them, and to witness graves appearing for individuals who were still alive. One particularly thorough account written by a local minister in 1897 outlined his experience of conducting a burial service and discovering graves for every congregation member, including people standing beside him at that moment. According to his narrative, the cemetery existed in a state where past, present, and future unfolded simultaneously. The next morning, Jennifer and I returned to Lost Soul Cemetery for what we agreed would be our conclusive visit. We aimed to attempt one final systematic examination of the site, yet we also recognized that the supernatural phenomena we had been experiencing could pose risks to both our safety and mental well-being. Upon arriving on Thursday morning, we discovered the cemetery reverted to the original configuration we'd seen during our first visit, featuring approximately 150 graves with no mark of the additional headstones recorded the previous day. However, anomalies persisted, indicating the temporal distortions were intensifying too. Several graves displayed multiple headstones for the same individual, their death dates ranging over several decades. In some instances, we could see the same person buried at different stages of life, as a child, as a young adult, and as an elderly individual, representing various lifespans they might have led. We also noticed graves of seemingly living individuals, including headstones bearing our own names with near-future death dates. These graves appeared and vanished as we moved through the cemetery, some remaining visible for only a few moments before fading from sight. Most unsettling of all was the realization we were no longer isolated within the cemetery. Throughout the morning, we began noticing other people wandering among the graves, dressed in clothing reflecting different historical periods, seemingly conducting their own research or tending to family graves. At first, we assumed they were other historians or genealogists who had inexplicably found their way to this remote site. Yet, whenever we approached or attempted to converse with them, they faded away like phantoms, only to reappear in different spots moments later. Some figures appeared to hail from the late 1800s, adorned in formal attire suitable for special occasions. Others seemed to belong to more modern decades, including a few individuals appearing to be contemporary researchers like us, equipped with modern cameras and documentation gear. One elderly woman, dressed in Victorian attire, came directly up to Jennifer, speaking in a voice that seemed to come from great distances. "You should not be here during the time of changes," she cautioned. "This place remembers all the lives that could have been lived, and all the deaths that could have happened. When the mountain took our men, it broke something in the natural order, and now all possibilities exist here simultaneously." As the woman's words echoed, my understanding deepened regarding the significance of Lost Soul Cemetery as a nexus of multiple timelines reflecting all of the tragic and fortuitous events that shaped mountain families' lives. "Some of us left after the mine disaster," she noted. "Some of us stayed and rebuilt. Some of us died young, while others survived to see great-grandchildren. This site shows all those possibilities at once, since grief and loss can distort time itself." When Jennifer asked if there was a means to document the cemetery's truthful history and the communities it had served, the woman's response combined wisdom with sadness. "The true history is that no single history exists," she explained. "Every family that lost someone during that mine collapse envisioned alternative avenues their lives might have traversed. Every survivor wondered about what would have transpired had different choices prevailed. This cemetery contains each of those imagined lives and those deaths, and it will continue to fluctuate among them as long as remembrance persists." As she concluded, the woman began to fade, but before entirely disappearing, she issued one last warning that compelled us to cease our research efforts. "Do not try to impose a singular timeline on this place," she cautioned. "Do not strive to force it into alignment with your academic understanding of history. Some losses are too profound to be contained within conventional time and space. Leave us our manifold possibilities and select another cemetery for your studies." That morning, Jennifer and I packed our equipment and departed Lost Soul Cemetery, never to return. We mutually agreed to exclude the site from our research initiative and to refrain from publishing any documentation we had compiled there. The experience illuminated the reality for us that certain historical sites reside beyond the standard confines of academic research, where trauma endured by mountain communities during events like mining disasters can lead to lingering effects that surpass traditional interpretations of time and space. Our summer research project ultimately centered on cemeteries firmly entrenched within conventional historical timelines, resulting in a digital archive, valuable to numerous genealogists and family historians. Yet often, I reflect on the revelations imparted by Lost Soul Cemetery, cognizant of the limitations surrounding any academic attempts to categorize and dissect human tragedy. Some lessons we gather from history are too intricate and painful to be boiled down into mere demographic information or timelines. Occasionally, the most honorable stance a researcher can take is to recognize that specific mysteries should remain unresolved, while certain sites ought to persist on their own terms, unconfined by conventional scholarly expectations. I'm 26 years old. The grave we were searching for was rumored to be located along a ridge near Bellwether Hollow. It isn't on any legitimate map, just a stretch of woods behind an abandoned church that looks as though it collapsed in on itself 50 years ago. The roof is mostly missing now, and a culvert nearby resembles more rust than pipe, while the tree line curves behind it, as if trying to hide something. Macy had a photocopy of a hand-drawn map crammed into the front pocket of her windbreaker. The paper felt soft at the edges, as though it had been folded and unfolded numerous times. She claimed to have found it in a historical archive in Menlo County, roughly 2 hours east of here. It wasn't even catalogued, merely stuffed in a file box with some WPA records from the 30s. It illustrated a burial plot, no names or dates, just a fenced rectangle marked resting place in black lettering. It seemed like someone had simply given up on figuring out who it was for. She didn't share much about why we were going, only that she wanted to see where he was buried. She never once indicated who he was. And I didn't inquire because the way she mentioned it suggested it was someone whose story couldn't really be condensed into a single sentence. I guessed it was an old family connection, one of those half-whispered tales that arise at Thanksgiving when a cousin suddenly mentions an uncle no one else speaks of. Perhaps a tragedy or something worse. She insisted she didn't believe in ghosts, yet she maintained that some places remember things, even when people don't. I agreed to accompany her, primarily because she asked. I'd known her since childhood, and she's not someone to request company without it being truly significant. She made it seem like a simple task, a quick trip before nightfall. We parked on a gravel pull-off, devoid of signage, just a break in the brush with tire tracks sunken into the dried mud. A barbed wire fence ran alongside the tree line, sagging where several posts had broken. No gate, just a spot where the wires hung low enough for us to step over. The air smelled of damp leaves and aged wood. No birdsong, no breeze. We climbed over and ventured into the woods. There was no trail, just dense trees close enough that our arms brushed against bark. The kind of growth that gives the impression of moving through something rather than simply walking atop it. The graveyard wasn't much of a graveyard at all. No gate, no archway, just two crooked iron rods with a rusted chain stretched between them. The type of entrance someone crafted just to indicate it was one. Inside, perhaps 20 headstones, low to the ground, all slanted or cracked, as though the forest was gradually pushing them away. I observed the entire place dipped in the center like a shallow bowl, too even and round, as if the land itself had been sinking in and kept settling, drawing everything toward its center. "This is it," Macy announced, crouching beside a split tree stump, its bark charred and blackened. "That stump's the marker. It got struck by lightning years ago. That's how I identified the site." I asked her which grave we were there to find. She pointed toward a wide, sunken headstone that bore no name or date, only a deep, rough cross that seemed hand-carved and uneven. An unrefined attempt, as if someone had started carving and halted midway. She pulled the map from her pocket, laying it flat with both hands. Her finger traced a faint note in the margin that read, "Cross marker, no inscription." I circled the stone slowly. The dirt under my boots felt strange, not soft as if it had been dug up, nor rocky. It had a peculiar, subtle give, like there were ridges buried just below the surface that shifted slightly with my weight. Then she drew out her phone. "I just want a picture," she stated, lifting it as if documenting a field trip. The screen went black. No flicker, no battery warning, just completely off, as if someone had yanked a cord from the wall. She frowned, tapped the screen. It was fully charged, 72%. I took out my phone, and it was the same, nothing. The screen felt cold in my hand. No buzz, no boot logo. It was just blank. We stood there, each grasping our phones as if they were betraying us. Then I heard something behind us. Dry leaves shifting, not crunching or snapping, merely sliding. Steady, like something dragged itself across the ground without lifting a foot. I turned, but no one was present. "Let's go," Macy suggested, her voice flat enough that I didn't argue. We began walking back the way we came, not hurried, but that sort of brisk pace one adopts when admitting to feeling anxious. The woods felt denser, as if the air had settled in. After a few minutes, I noticed something was off with the slope. The ridge we had just climbed should have been on our left, but all I saw was thick pine trees. We halted and turned around. The cemetery appeared behind us again. Those same rusted posts, the same half-sunken stones, the same burned stump, still split at the top. We didn't double back, I insisted, keeping an eye on our direction. We continued straight. Macy remained silent for a moment, staring at the grave with the cross. It was leaning somewhat forward, just enough that you wouldn't notice unless you had been paying attention before. It hadn't looked like that when we arrived. I took a step back. Let's try the other way. This time, we veered right. The path was slightly raised without underbrush, mostly moss and dry leaves, making it easier to navigate. 10 minutes later, the trees began to thin, and then we beheld it again. The same plot, the same chain, the same grave now sunken further. I remained silent for a time. Neither did she. "I think we need to stay put," I advised. "Someone will come looking." "No one's coming," she replied. Not sadly, just with certainty. She opened her bag, retrieving a small metal tin, unscrewing the lid. Inside was a vial of ash sealed with wax, pale grey like fine dust. She turned her head, wiping her face with her sleeve. "What is that?" I inquired. "It's his," she answered quietly, "from the place where he died." "You brought ashes?" I asked, surprised. "He never had a grave, just this stone. They marked it, but nothing was ever buried." I crouched beside the marker again, pressing my hand against the earth. It didn't feel dead. It felt as if something breathed just beneath the surface. A long, slow inhale. "I think it wants him back," she whispered. I began to dig, just my hands. The dirt yielded easily, no roots or stones, merely cold, dry earth. After digging down about a foot, I struck something hard, wood, old and splintered. I dug around it, felt the corner shift, and lifted the edge. A void remained, just packed soil beneath. Macy knelt beside me, uncorking the vial and pouring the ashes in. They flowed like a silent stream, settling on the broken wood. Then, behind us, a sound erupted, sharp and sudden. The stump split clean down the center with a crack like a log splitting in a fire. The air shifted. We turned, and just beyond the graveyard, where dense forest had existed before, a path now emerged, narrow, clean, and sloping down toward the road. We could see the car still there, covered in dust, waiting. Neither of us uttered a word. We simply walked, not too quickly or too slowly, as if we didn't want to startle whatever had allowed us to leave. My phone buzzed in my pocket before we reached the tree line. I pulled it out. Home screen displayed 72% battery. No texts, no missed calls, no evidence that it had ever shut off. Macy settled into the passenger seat and glanced out the window as I started the car. My hands trembled slightly on the wheel. As we pulled away, I glanced back. No clearing, no sign of the graveyard, just dense forest. I signed on with a regional preservation nonprofit, tasked with documenting lost family cemeteries scattered across the mountains. Some were so far off the beaten path they didn't even appear in county records anymore. I'd receive $50 per site for submitting a detailed report that included GPS pins, wide-angle shots, close-ups of headstones, and handwritten inscriptions. No benefits, but it was certainly an upgrade from my previous job waiting tables, plus it got me out of the apartment. Most of the sites were small, just a handful of stones nestled in clearings, half of which was sunken into the earth or too faded to decipher. I always kept a worn old Canon DSLR in my glove compartment, along with a notebook filled with scrawled notes and a laminated topo map marked with red ink showing each location. By that week, I had already logged 3 sites, driving along the cracked and winding backroads of Claiborne County while camping in a cheap rental cabin a few miles from town. It was solitary work. No supervisors, no petty office banter, just me and whatever remnants remained in the woods. The Jameson Hill site didn't appear in any official records. I only stumbled upon it because someone had hastily scrawled Jameson Hill possible site in pencil in the margin of my map, with nearly indecipherable coordinates squeezed beside it. No date, no initials, just that. I decided it was worth investigating. If I unearthed anything, I could add it to my log, and if not, I could at least enjoy a day outdoors. It was one of those early fall mornings where fog clung to everything like static. I lost service halfway up the road, typical. The gravel eventually gave way to dirt, which then turned into a moss-covered trail. The kind where your tires make the wet crunching noise that only echoes in places few have traversed for a while. I parked at the bottom of the hill and threw my gear over my shoulder. There was no sign, not even a faded relic, just an old rusted chain dangling between two spindly trees. It wasn't locked, merely looped through a hook. I stepped over and continued along the path. It wasn't challenging to follow, more of a deer track winding slowly through oaks and pines. After 20 minutes, the forest opened into a clearing that felt deliberate. It didn't appear landscaped, but the trees receded just enough to permit sunlight, as though someone fashioned it long ago, and nature had yet to reclaim it fully. That's when I noticed the stones, about 24 of them scattered like broken teeth in the earth, some half buried, others toppled or split down the middle. There was neither a gate nor a fence, no sign of a caretaker, just stone, vines, and the passage of time. I recognized a few family names: Denton, Mosby, the occasional Williams, surnames that I had come across before. Most of the burials dated back to the mid-1800s, give or take. Some were infants, others bore nothing but initials or years. 1854, 1872. A few were Civil War casualties, based on the dates and the faded iron stars half buried in the moss. I began cataloguing photos, coordinates, and quick sketches, always proceeding row by row, starting with the legible stones and working toward the less decipherable. Most had chips or were crooked. Some leaned as though nudged by tree roots ages ago. A few bore carvings that were still visible. 2 clasped hands, a dove with one wing missing, a 5-point star barely etched into one. Amid the row, I spotted something tucked away, half in the shadows where the clearing met the trees. One headstone stood out. It was taller than the rest, made of dark granite. No moss, no wear. It looked relatively newer, but not quite fresh as a modern memorial. It appeared preserved intentionally. The edges were sharp and the surface reflected light. It bore no name or quote, just one date engraved cleanly into the upper third, October 17th, 2010. That was it. The soil in front of it seemed too smooth, too pristine. Most grave sites gradually sink over time, especially in old cemeteries, yet not this one. No sinking, no weeds, no rocks. It didn't seem abandoned, almost like it was arranged or watched over. I crouched, preparing to take a photo, but as soon as I clicked the shutter, the screen went entirely white, not from overexposure, but like static, reminiscent of old TV snow. Frowning, I powered the camera off and back on again. All prior images were intact. I attempted the shot again and this time it worked. However, upon reviewing the image, a chill twisted in my chest, a tight, unseen tug as though I'd suddenly recalled something horrible, but couldn't pinpoint what. I stood up, adjusted my strap, and that's when I saw him. A man standing just inside the tree line across the clearing. I hadn't sensed him arrive. He stood stock still, arms rigid at his sides. He wore a heavy, dark coat, possibly canvas, and his jeans appeared waterlogged and caked with old mud, as if he'd trekked through miles of marsh. His skin had a waxy, off-color quality, and his mouth hung slightly open, as if he'd forgotten to close it. I raised a hand nonchalantly. "Hey there, just documenting for the archive." "This is public land." He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't even move. I stared at him for 5 or 6 seconds. I blinked, and he was gone. No sound, no stirring in the brush, nothing. I didn't finish photographing the last row. I simply grabbed my gear and made my way back down the path. When I reached the trees again, my stomach turned. The chain I had stepped over was back up, pulled tight between the trees, hooked shut in a way I'd not disturbed. I struggled to keep it open with both hands to get through. At the cabin, I plugged my camera into my laptop. All the shots appeared fine, except for that one of the dark headstone, the file corrupted. The thumbnails displayed the same white static, and they wouldn't open or copy. It felt as if that single shot didn't belong with the others. That night, I sent an email to the archive coordinator. inquiring if they had any records for a cemetery at those particular coordinates. I didn't hear back, so the next day, I drove into town and visited the county clerk's office. The woman behind the desk looked to be in her 60s. Friendly enough. I gave her the location, saying I was involved in preservation work. She consulted her database, then retrieved a large binder from behind the desk. After flipping through for several minutes, she looked up at me and said, "That property belongs to the Forestry Commission now. There's no burial site registered up there." I pulled out one of the clearer photos, displaying rows of moss-covered headstones nestled in the woods, and slid it toward her. She leaned in to study it before tapping the edge of the image. "That one," she stated quietly, "wasn't there when I was a girl." I inquired further, asking her to clarify. She fell silent, pushing the picture back toward me. "I'd steer clear of that hill," she warned. That night, something woke me, not loud, merely a soft sound of gravel shifting, like tires rolling slowly over a driveway. I peered out the window. It was empty. The trees remained still. Everything felt frozen. In the morning, I discovered a folded piece of paper hidden under my windshield wiper. It was damp from the fog, the ink slightly bleeding, but I could still read the message. "I remember you." That was it. I skipped breakfast, left the cabin key in the mailbox, and drove back to Asheville without stopping. I didn't take the job out of some noble reverence for the dead, but rather because I needed work. No other individuals were willing to tackle it. Even Marlin struggled to recruit someone to come along. The town wasn't exactly teeming with job prospects. The locals tended to speak about those places with a certain trepidation. Not precisely ghost stories or explicit warnings, more like a kind of avoidance. They'd refer to them as wrong places, as though that explanation sufficed. People didn't name them. They rarely visited either. No churches maintained them, no records chronicled them, and no signs pointed the way. Families historically buried their own in those areas, digging the holes themselves, carving what they could into stone, and leaving the woods to reclaim the rest. Some of those graves date back over 150 years, perhaps longer. Names worn smooth. Some markers were mere rocks with faint lines etched where someone had attempted to carve initials. Initially, I attributed it to Appalachian folklore. Every ancient site has its oddities. I thought a cemetery was a cemetery. The ground was indifferent to whether it was blessed, catalogued, or forgotten. But I was mistaken. These hills forget nothing, and they certainly don't appreciate being treated like any other locale. The first instance when something felt amiss was subtle. We were working at a site on Blackhorn Ridge, a real out-of-the-way location. No road leading there, just an old trail winding through thick laurels, a place you wouldn't stumble upon by accident. There were 11 graves, perhaps 12, all arranged in a semicircle near a crumbling stone wall. We wrapped up clearing around late afternoon, but the sun disappears quickly among those trees. One moment, you have golden light, and the next, it's just dusk. I was packing tools, preparing to swing the gate shut. Just a habitual act, really. The gate was one of those aged wrought iron types, half rusted and hanging slightly askew. As I reached for it, Marlin commanded, "Leave it." His voice was sharp, resonating, the kind you wouldn't expect from someone so subdued and old. I glanced back, startled, and observed his pale face, fixed intently. His hand gripped tightly around the rake's handle, knuckles appearing white. "Always leave it open," he said, as if each word carried profound significance. "Don't ever shut them in at night." I stood there, still grasping the gate, wanting to retort sarcastically about how the dead might require fresh air or evening strolls, but the look in his eyes silenced me. Not precisely fear, but more like a combination of respect and dread, as if he were recalling a rule that carried a grave cost. I released the latch and stepped back, departing with the gate left wide open behind us. He didn't utter another word throughout our return. The following week, Marlin handed me tools and instructed me to head to the Harrow place, up past the second bend near the Shah cropping. He wouldn't be joining. He mentioned a doctor's appointment, or possibly just didn't wish to go. It was difficult to discern his true intentions. He vaguely pointed uphill, claiming, "You'll know it when you see it." That trail hardly existed anymore. Battling through thick underbrush swathed in thorns and creeping vines, I focused on not thinking about snakes. After about 40 minutes, I located it. A clearing half ensnared by brambles, with 5 or 6 markers leaning in disarray, like intoxicated men at a bus stop. One was cracked in half, another supported by a rusted metal cross. I began my routine, clearing brush, trimming vines, sweeping moss off the stones. It was eerily silent. No bird calls, though that didn't register initially. At one point, I glanced up to count the graves. 7. That seemed accurate. Then, as I moved to straighten a slouched marker, I looked across again. Now there were 6. I halted, stared, and counted again. 1, 2, 3, 6. I returned to my starting point. 7. Tried again. 6. I moved slowly, not rushing, yet my results remained the same. A part of me wanted to dismiss it as merely an optical illusion. Perhaps the slope distorting my view, like how fence posts can appear more or less numerous based on your angle. But my instincts were already unsettled. Then came the noise behind me, emerging from the brush. It wasn't sharp, a crunch of a twig or a bird rustling. It was slow, soft, rhythmic, like skin sliding over dry leaves, a dragging shuffle. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I raised my clippers as if they could do anything, but nothing stood there, just woods, silent and unmoving. I convinced myself it was a possum or a large raccoon. Bending, I hurriedly clipped a tangle near one of the stones, though my hands trembled now. Once finished, I stacked the brush near the gate. Another old iron creation, bent and sagging but still intact, before stepping towards the trail, only to find it wasn't the one I had entered. This path veered upward. The direction felt incorrect. The angle of light seemed wrong too, but with no other option, I proceeded, figuring it would loop back. 10 minutes later, I emerged into a clearing, the same clearing, merely approached from another side. The cracked stone and cross confirmed it. The layout was unchanged, yet something was different. There were now more stones, not 6, not 7, but 10. I counted aloud, disregarding how foolish I sounded. My mouth felt dry, my chest constricted. I whispered the numbers repeatedly, hoping they might revert to what they had been. Then, from behind me, the gate creaked, dragging metal sounds, hinges protesting, followed by the clink of the latch dropping into place. I didn't dare look. I didn't want to witness who or what had secured it. The only thing reverberating in my mind was Marlin's voice, calm yet firm. Don't ever shut them in at night. I ran. No path, no plan. I simply bolted towards the gate, slamming into it at full speed, feeling it yield. It tore sideways on its hinges, nearly coming off entirely. I didn't stop. The brush shredded my shirt. Thorns clawed my arms. Roots threatened to trip me. I didn't care. I dashed until I burst onto the gravel road, gulping air like I'd never inhaled before, and everything appeared normal again. Birdsong filled the air, trees rustled in the breeze, and a tractor could be heard in the distance across the ridge. Behind me, the trail looked like any unremarkable path through the woods. I climbed into my truck, hands shaking so badly that I dropped the keys. I sat there for 10 minutes before I could drive. I never returned to that plot, didn't inquire about it from Marlin, nor mentioned it at all. Whatever transpired up there, I wasn't interested in pursuing further. Marlin passed away that spring, quietly, with no funeral announcement. One of those events people came to know through casual conversation. His niece informed the hardware clerk, who then relayed it to someone at the diner. That's how I became aware. No one knew his burial site, only that it resided among the old places in the hills. No ceremony, no photographs, merely a freshly installed gate that materialized one day at a cemetery long abandoned. Strangely, no one witnessed anyone putting it there. It simply appeared as though it had always belonged. Now, whenever I traverse the back roads, I encounter gates, some rusted, others newly painted, some standing alone without any stones in sight. But each one remains firmly closed. The cemetery lay about 10 minutes past Eris Ridge, a place so small you'd likely miss it if you blinked during the turn. It only featured a solitary old sign, leaning as if it had surrendered, and a narrow gravel road that wound up into the Appalachian hills until it felt as if the woods might consume you entirely. In the back stood a white church with faded siding and a tin roof that rattled in storms. I had taken the job primarily for the peace it offered. I had recently been laid off from my previous position. Nothing special, just a local gig. When someone mentioned that the old cemetery needed a groundskeeper, I thought, why not? The pay was sufficient, and all I had to do was keep the grass trimmed, clear away weeds, and ensure that paths didn't become overgrown for the occasional burial or visitor. Twice a month, maybe more in the summer. There was no one looking over my shoulder, no co-workers, no substantial pressure. It sounded perfect, and initially, it was surprisingly serene. I would load up the mower and tools in my truck, head out early, and spend the day in almost total silence. Sometimes I played music through my phone's speaker just to hear a hint of humanity. However, much of the time, I simply allowed the silence to envelop me. No traffic, no voices, just the hum of the mower and the wind rustling through the trees. I came home sweaty, sore, and slightly sunburnt, but honestly, I reveled in it. That feeling was short-lived. It began subtly, small things that didn't seem worth complaining about. I recall the first moment something felt amiss. I was mowing near the back corner by a stone angel, its wings half chipped and its face worn smooth. I had cut the grass around it, propped my rake against its base, and walked a few rows over to dispose of the clippings. I hadn't been away long, perhaps 5 minutes, but when I turned back, the path leading to the statue felt longer, stretching out like the rows had multiplied. I paused, blinking and wondering if I might have taken a wrong turn. I walked, legs burning, and upon finally reaching the statue, my rake was gone. I soon discovered it 3 rows away, lying flat beside a headstone with a sunken top. I hadn't moved it there. I was certain of that. Still, I brushed it off. Perhaps I had gotten turned around, or maybe the heat had played tricks on my mind. However, these occurrences continued. The following week, it was my water jug, one I always brought, a large blue plastic one with a twist cap and a dent on its side. I set it underneath the oak tree in the center of the cemetery as I usually did, but every time I returned for it, it had shifted. Initially, it was balanced on a headstone at an odd angle, as though intentionally placed there. I chuckled, thinking maybe I had just forgotten where I placed it. But the second time, it was standing by the fence line, upright but on the ground. The third time, it was perfectly balanced on the grave of a little girl who had died in 1887, her tombstone worn and featuring a carved lamb reduced to a lump. I distinctly remember feeling a chilling sensation, a strange pressure against my chest. I avoided touching it for a long time. Subsequently, I started working faster. I kept my head down and didn't stop for breaks unless absolutely necessary, but the atmosphere made it challenging. The mower began battling against me. Its wheels would drag, as if stuck in something, even though the ground was flat. At times, the engine sputtered, choking for no apparent reason, despite the gas being fine. Once, I reached for the handle only for it to scorch my palms. I dropped it immediately. A moment later, I tested it again, and it was cool, as though nothing had happened. The gravestones began to behave strangely too. One in particular stood out, a simple headstone for James Harlan, a Civil War veteran. I remembered it well. The letters quite sharp even after all that time. Yet one day, as I passed by, the stone was blank, just smooth grey. I stood in disbelief. I walked an entire loop, certain I must have mistaken the spot. But upon my return, the letters resurfaced. Only now they appeared crooked and misspelled, as if someone had attempted to recarve it from memory, but had failed miserably. That evening, I sat in my truck for an extended period before turning the key. I didn't realize how tightly I was gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. Still, I kept returning, convincing myself of fatigue or that perhaps my brain had fried in the sun. That rationale persisted right until I encountered him. This happened about 2 weeks after the gravestone incident. I was trimming the edge near the fence when I heard footsteps crunching steadily on the gravel path, unhurried. I glanced up to see an older man dressed in faded overalls, his limp evident as he walked slowly through the rows. He didn't look in my direction at all. I assumed he was visiting someone, so I waved and said something like, "Afternoon," but received nothing in return. He continued on, head down, stepping carefully. Out of curiosity, I started to follow him, thinking maybe he hadn't heard me or perhaps needed assistance. However, when I turned the corner, the row was empty, just grass and stones in that same oppressive silence. I even called out, but my voice sounded peculiar amid the stillness, small and out of place. After that, I stopped attempting to be polite. I kept focused on my work, avoiding following anyone or speaking unless necessary, but the place wasn't done with me yet. The paths began to alter, narrowing uncomfortably. While trimming the grass, I would realize that the space between the stones was too snug, like they had shifted overnight. I often had to maneuver the mower sideways just to get through. On several occasions, I became wedged and had to back out awkwardly, straining my arms. I once believed I was nearing completion after hours of work when I spotted the same set of headstones I had already passed, a repetition of names and cracks in the stone. When I turned around, I noticed another identical row behind me, as though the land had folded in on itself. That was when I began to feel a bit panicked. I concealed it, not even from myself, but this low buzz in my chest refused to dissipate, making me uneasy. I would check my watch and could swear an hour had passed despite the sun's static position, or I'd believe only 20 minutes had passed while shadows elongated. Then came the final day. I arrived before sunrise, planning to power through and complete the entire area before noon, promising myself a break after tackling the back rows. I began at the farthest point and moved steadily in rows, as usual. Yet, after nearly an hour had passed, I realized I hadn't spotted the oak tree. This detail struck me as odd. It always stood at the center, and I would pass by it at the halfway mark. But it wasn't there. I halted, scanning around. The rows appeared longer. They seemed to stretch out further than they should have. Eventually, I spotted the tree in the distance, and at the base was my water jug. The same one, with the same dent. Yet I hadn't brought it with me that day. I intentionally left it at home. I distinctly recalled filling it the night prior and deciding against taking it with me. But there it was, resting neatly in the grass, cap tightly secured. I didn't approach it. Instead, I stood there for what felt like a long time, staring as if it might rise up and scurry away. After a moment, I turned to head toward the gate, only to discover the paths no longer aligned. The rows leaned in, the stones crowded closer, and the mower scraped vehemently against the granite on both sides. It felt as if the entire place were folding inwards, pulling me back. I abandoned the mower right then and there, starting to run, arms raised to shield my face as I pushed through the rows. Stones snagged at my sleeves, grass whipped around my legs. Every turn appeared like the last. Was I moving forward or deeper into the place? I pressed on. Not a moment did I stop or look back.